about how to play sovereign chess. Greetings, chess geeks. Today we're talking about how to play sovereign chess, so let's start. Sovereign chess is a variation of chess that is played on a modified chessboard using colored chess pieces. All the regular rules of chess apply except for a few changes. The basic objective of the game is to checkmate the opponent. Rules of sovereign chess. Board is laid out between the two players, and the game begins with the positioning of the pieces. The pieces are positioned on the outer ring of the board according to the color and type of the piece indicated around the edge of the board. Pawns are placed into the next ring with the squares matching the color of the adjacent pieces. The matching colored knights are placed in the four corners of the second ring of squares instead of the pawns. A player is randomly chosen to begin the game with the white piece. In the next turn, the other player gets an opportunity to choose white or black as their pieces. The player who gets black makes the next move, and the game proceeds with alternating turns. Players are not allowed to move their queens, bishops, and rooks more than 8 squares in a single turn, so they cannot check a king that is beyond 8 squares. King is considered out of check if it moves out of the 8-square range. It is allowed for the piece to travel over a square of its own color, but it is not allowed to end its turn on a square of its own color. This rule makes it impossible for the player to check their opponent's king with a piece of the same color as the square that the king is on, and the king can escape by moving to a square matching the color of the checking piece. Players are only allowed to move their pawns 1 square vertically or horizontally, but they can only capture 1 square diagonally towards the center of the board. There are 4 brown lines that meet at the center of the board, which guide the movement of the pawns. It is allowed for the player to move their pawns and capture towards either brown line, irrespective of the pawn's location from another brown line. A pawn must not jump or cross the brown line adjacent to it, but is allowed to capture across a brown line if the capture takes it closer to the center of the board. The pawns positioned on the outer 2 rings of the board are allowed to move 1 or 2 spaces away from the closest edge. If the players position their pieces onto a square of any color on the board, blue for example, they get control of all the pieces of that square's color. They must use those colored pieces for as long as they have their piece on that square. Once the player removes their piece from that color, they lose control of the colored pieces until they manage to occupy a square of matching color. Players are allowed to use the colored pieces to gain possession of their colored pieces. When you move a piece to a square that is in the same color as your opponent's king, you do not gain control of their pieces. A player cannot acquire possession of pieces that match the color of the opponent's king. Every color has 2 squares on the board, but only one of them can be occupied at a time. If a player occupies 1 square of a particular color, whether a player controls it or not, then the square of that color may not be occupied. The only colored pieces that can be captured are the ones controlled by the player's opponent. If a player manages to capture an opponent's piece positioned on a colored square, the player gets control of all the pieces of that square's color. A check can be avoided from a colored piece if the player captures the matching squares their opponent controls. The promotion of the pawn takes place when it arrives inside the center 4x4 area marked by a black border. The pawn can be promoted to any higher rank of the same color. If a player decides to promote their pawn to the king, they must remove their current king from the board and place the new king of the same color of the pawn. When the pawn gets promoted to the king of a different color, the colored pieces of the previous king can be controlled by the player who occupies the square of that color. A player can complete their turn by replacing their king with the king of any color they control instead of moving a piece. If the king ends up on a square of its own color, then the player must continue their turn and move it off that square. The check can be avoided or escaped by the player by promoting to a king or changing their king's color. The castling with the rook can be done by the player if it's on the same row as their king, and all the normal rules of castling are followed. How to win in sovereign chess? The first player that manages to checkmate their opponent wins the game. This is it, folks. Make sure you thoroughly go through this video and the rules. Enjoy your playing. If you like the video, hit the like button and don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel.